Welcome back to ＳիվիլNet. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott. I'm delighted to have a recurring guest and friend, Richard Giragosian, who's the Yerevan-based director of the Regional Studies Center. Richard, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Let's start. We're going to go country specific today. We have a lot to unpack. Let's start with Azerbaijan. We're the day after a historic Aliyev win in their very free and fair elections, where 92% of the Azeri population decisively elected their leader. Can you unpack the election a little bit? We all know it's a kind of a dog and pony show, but what's the significance? Why even bother?
Well, even before we look at the significance, the meaning, and the intention, one observation. This is very much another step by Azerbaijan in becoming the North Korea of the South Caucasus. Very much a family affair. This is yet another father-to-son consolidation of power, where the Aliyev family, father and son, have been ruling the country since 1993. In other words, no one under the age of 30 in Azerbaijan remembers having a different President Aliyev. And the Azerbaijani people were once again robbed of either a voice or a choice in terms of a leadership by selection rather than election. But I think most outrageously was Ilham Aliyev's voting for himself in Stepanakert, which also revealed the intention behind this early election, 1 year early. This was an attempt at seeking and garnering legitimacy and a fresh mandate, not through a free and fair election because there's no precedent or tradition of that, but rather for the ceremonial trappings of an election. Now, what's important is the psychological aspect. For Ilham Aliyev, recent developments represent the first time in his life that he's been able to step out of the shadow of his father. This is very Freudian. It's very psychologically deep in its meaning. What's also important is what happens next. In other words, with a king that is crowned once again, or more appropriately, the Sultan, what we can expect is even more bellicose rhetoric, even more aggressive threats coming from Azerbaijan directed not just against Armenia, but against Armenians. And there is an interesting discourse. But again, at the end of the day, this was no surprise. The only real validation of the ballot process was, of course, by Russia. And what's interesting is the timing of this election is mirrored by the coming election within Russia as well, which I think will have very similar results.
To actually talk about the Turkish factor, which is always important to mention here when we talk about Azerbaijan, Erdogan was the first to congratulate Aliyev on his victory before the results were even announced, which is very cute. Let's talk a little bit about the military shakeups that's going on within Azerbaijan. At the start of the year, Azerbaijan did a couple interesting things. They signed a renewed agreement on the Turkish model army building within Azerbaijan, and present at that meeting, you had next to Zakir Hasanov, you had this Turkish general who was essentially commanding the Azeri army during the 2020 Karabakh War, sitting to his right, wearing an Azeri uniform, so making no secret of who's really in charge. That's the first interesting development, which I'd like you to unpack. And then part of that is that they also named, Aliyev appointed the commander of their Yashma Special Forces Battalion as if I'm not mistaken, the deputy defense minister and effectively the commander of Azerbaijan's army. Essentially, they promoted him, and from what we know of him, he's not somebody to be dismissed. He fought in both Karabakh wars. He was trained in Turkey. He's the head of their special forces. He's a dangerous man. What does that mean for us? Is this something we should take note of and be worried about? Is this some preparation for war, or is this all internal? Is this related to power struggles between the Russian side and the Turkish side, factions within Azerbaijan? Unpack this for us.
Well, I think in a general sense, we should be concerned. If we look since the war of 2020 and we look at recent developments, unfortunately, it would be irresponsible not to be concerned. And the threat of war, the threat of military action against Armenia continues, if not increasing. But if we look precisely at what's going on within Azerbaijan, there are two elements of this context. The first is, as you've mentioned, yet again, this is somewhat of a power struggle between rival pro-Russian versus pro-Turkish factions within the armed forces, where it's personified by the defense minister, Hasanov, who is not only pro-Turkish, but enjoys the backing, especially from the Turkish special forces, rather than the conventional land army. And on the other hand, the general staff, which is a legacy pro-Russian and Russian-favored faction. These are the more corrupt, much more incompetent elements. And we do see the increase in influence, of course, not just of Turkey, but more importantly, the influence of Turkish-backed elements within Azerbaijan itself. The second element of this new context is more interesting and something more recent. That is a move by President Aliyev personally to ensure or to gain greater personal authority and control over key elements of the armed forces. In other words, Aliyev's appointments, his moves into personnel policy, represent a weakness, insecurity, if not paranoia. Because the defense minister of Azerbaijan is increasingly overly ambitious, and I do think there is a question within the Aliyev family over the reliability of such a person. Azerbaijan, after all, is a country with a history of a military coup years ago, and this does defy the first directive from Gaidar Aliyev when he passed power to his son Ilham Aliyev. That first directive was to keep the army weak and under control, because the only perceived threat to the Aliyev government and family was the military. Now that the military is emboldened and much more capable, it is also potentially a domestic threat rather than just an external threat to Armenian security. And finally, what we see is, yes, Azerbaijan is pursuing a new path of building a military capability based on NATO standards. For Armenia, this is even more of an imperative for military education, training, and doctrine in Armenia to better understand, if not embrace, the very same NATO standards. So we're prepared to fight the next war instead of trying to repeat the last war.
There's two interesting developments that are very recent. Number one, Azeri Special Forces conducted mountain warfare training in the snow in heavy winter conditions against the conventional army. Something that Turkish Special Forces have a lot of experience in, fighting in the mountainous regions against the Kurds. It's obvious who this was directed at, and generally we see a pattern where every single spring there's an assault, and every single fall there's an assault, and then things go quiet over the winter. It's concerning to see that they're preparing to break that pattern. And the second half of that is we're noticing an increase in, test flights from the Azeri and Turkish Air Force from both sides, all along the Armenian border, which it's been kind of implied that they're scouting to find where Armenia's air defenses are located. So what's your take on this? Is this just a lot of, Armenian panicking, or is it something that we should be watching for?
Well, I think both. In other words, after the September loss of Artsakh, of Nagorno-Karabakh, the military campaign objectives of Azerbaijan are very different. And the both posture as well as the strategic landscape is now focused more on Sunik in terms of southern Armenian security or insecurity. And I think militarily that's a very different context than Azerbaijan's military objectives retaking control of Nagorno-Karabakh and engaging in the ethnic cleansing that expelled the Armenian population. But I would say the one area to watch is new. It's Iran. We should expect Azerbaijan to once again heighten tension with Iran And these military drills follow earlier military exercises by Azerbaijan that were solely directed against Iran. The reason this danger is more recent and more real is the situation in Israel. After Gaza, we see Netanyahu's domestic political popularity suffering. And I do think the personal relationship between the Israeli leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, and President Aliyev will provide incentive for Netanyahu to seek Azerbaijan's help in raising tension against Iran as a distraction from his own domestic political weakness. Moreover, there is a widespread feeling in Israel that the Americans are too soft on Iran. And for Azerbaijan, this is a way to regain strategic significance for Azerbaijan after losing significance after the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, where Azerbaijan is significantly less important to the Pentagon, for example. But overall, I do think the situation in terms of the military context is a concern. What's most important is why the military situation remains a threat. And it's because of the absence of deterrence, where no one and nothing is stopping Azerbaijan. Because of the second reason, the war of 2020 and everything since has been a dangerous precedent, a distressing validation of Azerbaijan's use of force. In other words, its Western weakness and the lack of international resolve that emboldens Azerbaijan to rely on force and the threat of force.
One last question before we switch gears here and talk about Turkey a little bit. This also is linked to Turkey in a way. So our previous guest, Leonid Nersisyan, a military expert based in London, he was talking about the upgrades that the Turks did to Soviet legacy aircraft that Azerbaijan has within its air force, and how they've been basically retrofitted with, upgraded targeting and missile systems. They can now fire Turkish guided missiles, which he qualified as potentially the next Bayraktar. In other words, long-range missiles that can get us from far outside of any kind of air defenses that we have, and that would be very difficult to counter. What's your take on this? Because when we spoke last time, right, you also kind of said that the Air Force is a weaker element within the Azerbaijani military.
Well, Leonid has an interesting point, and I respect his analysis very much. And in fact, he may have sources in London very different than my own analysis. But I would argue that the capability, the combat readiness, and technical capacity of this upgrade, if you will, is not as clear-cut, nor as successful as it seems, because there's an interesting technical contradiction between Soviet legacy airframes and NATO standard missiles. The real contradiction here is in the firing system and the targeting system of the airframe that does not match the Western NATO standard. So in other words, yes, strap on a new missile to the plane, but firing and delivering that missile will not be as easy or as operationally effective. My second point in terms of the weakness of the Air Force, I do think there's an interesting disparity between the development of air capacity or air power in Azerbaijan in terms of fixed wing versus rotary wing, planes, jets versus helicopters. In this landscape, the terrain and topography of southern Armenia, of Nagorno-Karabakh, is more favorable to the use of combat helicopters, rotary wing, and much less fixed-wing aircraft. This is also why we have no real record of any bombing campaigns by the Azerbaijani Air Force. So I do think the Air Force is rather neglected in terms of the overall priorities in Azerbaijan, just as the Navy is overly focused on Caspian or maritime security. But I do think there's an interesting contradiction between the fixed wing versus rotary wing.
Let's talk about Turkey a little bit, because they're kind of the elephant in the room here. They recently have finally scored their long-awaited F-16s and so the upgrades, and also some new F-16s. What do you make of this? I've seen differing reports. Is this a diplomatic win for Erdogan, or is it a defeat?
Well, I think it's premature to judge. In other words, it's a little of both right now. It's a defeat in two ways. As important as the F-16 seems to be in Turkey, militarily it's not that important. It's long been planned as yet another upgrade to NATO member Turkey's contribution and position within the NATO alliance. Secondly, Greece has actually moved to receive more than F-35s. Turkey. Exactly. So I saw, sorry to cut you off, but I saw a report stating that the Turks will receive the F-16s at the same time that the Greeks receive the F-35s, which will be in a few years, in other words. It's not like they're going to arrive tomorrow. Exactly. The other important thing is, what's the quid pro quo? Erdogan has backed down in terms of opposition to Swedish application to join NATO. And this was very welcome in Moscow. Hungary is also now the latest obstacle to Swedish ascension. But I do think Erdogan is very much a transactional authoritarian leader, both within his country and externally. There's a price to pay for everything for Turkey. In terms of the Armenian context, what's most interesting is how Turkey has become prisoner of Azerbaijan, and how Turkish policy options in this region are subject to Azerbaijani approval. This is both insulting to Turkey, but it's also widening the divide that has already been growing. There's a disparity, if not disagreement, between Turkey and Azerbaijan over Gaza, where Turkey has embraced Hamas on the one side, and on the other side, Aliyev's personal relationship with Netanyahu and aid from Israel has put him firmly in the opposite camp. And I do think this widening division and divide is actually sparking more tension in the relationship. Interesting. We're not seeing any. Is there any public manifestations of this? Okay, can you point to any kind of events where we can see it? Because all we see from the outside is just glowing brotherhood and friendship between the two. I would say there are two demonstrable displays of this publicly. One is the dueling statements of support, where if you look at the diplomatic language coming from the foreign ministries in Ankara versus Baku, it's night and day. And in fact, it's almost confrontational. Secondly, if we look at votes in the United Nations and other international forums, we see Azerbaijan and Turkey opposing each other. And this is something I think we need to exploit. I want to talk a little bit about domestic capabilities that Turkey is developing, because part of the reason they wanted these F-16 upgrade packages so badly is so that they can kind of reverse engineer their own fifth-generation fighter, right? The Khan that they're supposedly doing in joint production with Pakistan and Azerbaijan. I mean, so far, all we've seen is they've expressed interest, nothing really committed. An official at the U.S. Embassy here, who shall remain nameless, said that, and I quote here, you can make any test flight look good on video. In other words, he was very dismissive of Turkish technological advances. What's your take on this? Are they able to build something competent, a fifth generation fighter, all the stuff that they're claiming that's in the works? And what does that imply for us as well? Well, I would question the premise of your question in terms of what technological progress by Turkey. In fact, if we look at this particular ambition, Turkey is looking to Pakistan and Azerbaijan for defense industrial capacity and technology. I think that's a mistake. This is also why Armenia is much smarter in looking to India. And I do think if this was a more serious project, they would look to China rather than Pakistan. But I do think this is a more limited ambition, and it is also more about operational needs in northern Syria, as well as against the Kurds by Turkey, rather than an effort to become more of a regional power.
Well, my worry is always that this stuff will trickle over to Azerbaijan. That even though they're not entirely focused there, I mean, we know that the F-16s ran interference during the 2020 war. It was a very serious issue for our own pilots. So that's really, at the end of the day, I don't care what they're playing with over there in Turkey. My fear is that it's going to end up in Azerbaijan and then used against us.
Well, as you pointed out, it's more than a fear, it's a precedent.
Yeah. Well, so what can we do to potentially counter that?
Well, on the one hand, I do think the greater Western or NATO-style military education and training for Armenia should also include air defense as well as Armenian pilots. In order to counter F-16s, you need to understand the operational details of an F-16. Rather than training only on MiGs and SUs, I do think greater acquaintance, greater comfort with Western weapon systems by Armenia offers us a better chance to counter or defend against attacks by these same weapon systems.
Do you think we should potentially look to buying Dassault Rafales from France?
No, only because if we look in recent history, including the last government, we've wasted far too much money and far too much time in pursuing air assets that were either artificial or ineffective.
Or unused, right? Didn't leave the tarmac.
Exactly, or fire, or have a missile.
Yeah.
In other words, I would stress more air defense as we're procuring from India, for example.
Mm. Well, let's shift gears. Let's talk about Armenian developments. There've been some very interesting stuff. It's not all negative. So first of all, let's talk about actually Andranik Kocharyan's most recent comments. He made an interview about 2 days ago, and essentially what he was saying is that in the very near future, what we can expect is a reshuffling of the top brass within the Armenian army. He made it clear that they're keeping General Asryan, but his entire entourage is going to be reshuffled with younger guys who are NATO-trained with NATO experience. He deliberately used that language. What do you make of that? Is this a positive development or a negative development, if true?
Well, we don't yet know. In other words, Andranik Kocharyan is the chairman of the Defense Committee of Parliament. To his credit, I do think he is endowing this parliamentary position, the chairmanship, with greater authority. In Armenia, where the parliament has been far too ineffective and unwilling, if not unable, to exercise oversight legislatively or initiative. Having said that, if we look at his specific announcement, it depends on who is being promoted, who is being dismissed. Being younger does not necessarily mean they're smarter or better. However, I do think this is part of a earlier, broader trend where we see a generational change in the demographics of the armed forces and the Armenian officer corps, away from the largely Soviet legacy or Moscow-trained elements, and away from the generation that garnered much more experience in Soviet Armenia than they did in independent Armenia. This transition is natural, it's welcome, but it's too soon to judge. Also because it should be merit-based and performance-based, not necessarily based on the year of birth or the English language capability.
Well, you mentioned specifically that they'll be drawn largely from our peacekeeping corps, which have NATO training.
It's elite.
They're the best of the best for us, essentially, right? And it's actually important to note that these are the guys who also went out in 2018 in the streets, right, with threat of court martial, and they were the guys from the peacekeeping corps. The Blue Berets went out to protest for democracy in this country.
Well, not just
more
protest,
Western guys, let's say.
They went out in support of Pashinyan.
Well, of the Armenian people and of democracy, right? I also want to make sure, right, it wasn't just about him. But that said, yeah, so to me, these are interesting developments. You've also had, you had some French high-ranking generals who were here just last week, who were, preparing partnership between our military academy in Saint-Cyr, which is the French West Point. You had a delegation from the Defense Department in the U.S. who were here last week. There's something going on. There's something in the water. Tell us, Richard. Unpack it for us.
Well, what I see, this actually all began with the deployment of the EU monitoring mission, which was far more significant than what it ordinarily would represent. Yes, they're unarmed, but this commitment by the EU to Armenian security is unprecedented for the European Union in one key respect. Armenia, at the end of the day, is still a member of the Russian-dominated Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. Armenia is the host of a Russian military base and a military airfield. Despite that, we have EU commitment and interest to Armenian security and the deployment of EU monitors. What's most interesting about the visit of the French was the Azerbaijani overreaction. In fact, even the EU ambassador in Baku had to issue a statement challenging the Azerbaijani government's accusations against the French. And what we also see is the French, as well as to a degree the Germans, and as you've noted, the United States, are all now looking to increase their commitment to Armenia's security needs and defensive capabilities. And I think Armenia now has emerged as the only contributor to regional stability, where all of our other neighbors are actually detrimental to regional stability and security.
Interesting. Last week, the Azeri foreign minister issued a statement saying that something along the lines that if the EU provides weapons and defensive capabilities to Armenia, they risk destabilizing the situation. Some kind of inane statement. Now, in my humble opinion, when you see things like that before anything else has been announced, it kind of implies that they caught wind that the Europeans are planning on sending us some toys or at least some money. What's your assessment? For them to react that way when there's been no announcement, that tells me like they know something we don't.
Well, yes. In other words, that premature overreaction by Azerbaijan also only confirms that Brussels is even more interested than before in bolstering Armenian security. What's most interesting, having recently been in Brussels and going again in April, is what I've observed. The interest is much more unprecedented in terms of the EU is much more interested in providing Armenia with assistance in the security sector, more than Armenia is interested or asking for such assistance. In other words, that's unprecedented as well. Armenia is no longer begging or requesting. We are now the prize for the EU. A lot of this is within the context of Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine and broader regional security. But I do think Armenia's credentials, a rare commodity of legitimacy, genuine democratic credentials, and let's say performance electorally, has meant that Armenia is now recognized as a reliable partner for the West.
Yeah, you're seeing like very, very interesting trends. You're no longer hearing both sidesism, that kind of language. Again, the fact that you've had Defense Department people visiting regularly, there's definitely there's a noticeable shift. The issue, of course, would be policy continuity, right? We need to prepare for the eventuality of a Trump presidency and what that would mean for Armenia. What's your assessment there?
Well, I mean, the danger or risk of a return of Donald Trump as an American president is a risk to the United States and to democracy more than a threat to Armenia per se. And I would argue, analytically, it really doesn't make that much of a difference, whether it's Trump or Biden reelected. specifically because the White House has never been the major factor in U.S.-Armenian relations. It's always been the Congress, Armenia's congressional support. And I, in this regard, think Armenia is far too remote and down the list of American priorities, no matter who is reelected. Nevertheless, we do see the Biden administration delivering rather than just announcing positive feelings for Armenia. I think more needs to be done, of course. But if we remember the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and her commitment and visit to Armenia, this is overwhelmingly the Democrats who are delivering. Yeah. And I do think the Republicans are now looking to cut aid and assistance to Ukraine. Trump,
but not to Israel, of course.
Of course. But Trump is also much more inclined to support both Erdogan and Putin. In that regard, it will be a factor. But again, indirectly.
Well, the issue is inaction, right? Is that it's always the Trump show. And so we saw during the 2020 war, you know, Trump intervened for a second to announce what a great mediator he is. He put a ceasefire that lasted, 4 hours, and then moved on, right? And that was about it. So the issue is just a lack of attention. That worries me. Onto something a little bit more positive, actually, is if you're starting to see some interesting trends even internally in Armenia. I'm speaking notably about the new appointment of the new high-tech minister, Richard Giragosian, who, as far as we know, he's been kind of a silent figure within Pashinyan's party. But you can tell his interest from the get-go because he's been around for 30 days, and he's had 3 official meetings with heads of military industrial companies here in Armenia. So you're starting to see this kind of synergistic cooperation with the defense ministry, with the private sector, and now the high-tech ministry that's also becoming very active. I mean, my opinion, it's my personal opinion, but the previous guy was an incompetent bozo and good riddance. I'm not mincing my words here. I've had local business community in Armenia complain about him repeatedly. So you're starting to see this interesting trends where you're starting to have people who I would consider to be quite capable, maybe not in the traditional sense or through education, but just through trial by fire, right? I'm talking about someone like Elliott and Giragosian, you know, the head of the Security Council, now Mr. Richard Giragosian. I think Papikyan, the defense minister, I would like the reforms to be faster, but he's doing some pretty significant and pretty interesting stuff. What's your take overall?
Well, first of all, if we look in terms of the tech sector, in terms of the government, ministerial responsibilities, the current challenge, in my opinion, is the need for a more specific clarification of boundaries and jurisdictions or authorities. Yeah. In other words, we have the Ministry of Economy, we have the Ministry of Defense. Both are integral and essential for the development of defense technology. But where is the Ministry of High Tech, and how does it balance the contradictory jurisdictions? More needs to be done in that regard in terms of authority. What we also see in the broader sense is we also see a recent appointment, a new appointment of the head of the Foreign Intelligence Body.
Yeah.
It was interesting because of the replacement. The former recently installed director was expected to stay longer and to spearhead reform and actually professional development. Why is this change taking place? I don't know, nor do I really know much about the new director.
Wait, I'm sorry, it wasn't the former human rights defender?
It was. She's
been replaced.
She's been replaced.
Wow, I actually didn't know that. Wow.
So it's something to watch. He's an attorney by training. He does have a very prominent reputation in terms of human rights in the armed forces and in terms of tackling hazing, etc.
Interesting.
But I don't know if this particular new initiative is as serious as it should be. Is it real for the Armenian government? And my other example is the National Security Council, which is dangerously underutilized by the government.
In what way?
in terms of process and decision making, whether it's the national security strategy, in terms of implementation, training, the analytical capabilities are undervalued and underused. The National Security Council has much more of a role to play in the process of decision making. And this is a deficiency where the Prime Minister still micromanages. It's overly centralized in his office, and more of delegation of authority and decisions need to be shared, especially with Parliament, as well as other state bodies and ministries.
This actually is a very good segue in something I didn't initially plan on talking about, but there's rumors of some, let's say, infighting within the ruling party, more notably between the pro-Russia and pro-Western factions. Do you see any evidence of that, or is it some kind of rumor? My suspicion is that the reason that there's so much micromanaging is that Pashinyan doesn't know who to trust, essentially. He doesn't trust anybody. He's got this siege mentality. That's my humble opinion in this. I don't know enough about it to make any real assessments here, but I'd like your opinion. What do you think?
Well, two opinions or observations rather than an analytical fact. On the one hand, I disagree. I don't see the Prime Minister of Armenia not trusting anyone or being in a siege mentality. Rather, I still think Prime Minister Pashinyan makes the same mistake of playing favorites, sometimes too often. And people sometimes are brought in and then thrown overboard and then recycled. There's no rhyme or reason. There's little logic in this personnel policy of favorites. The second observation, though, is infighting within civil contract, within the pro-government big tent, if you will, is natural. It's normal. There's infighting in any real political party.
Yeah, of course.
The important thing is how this infighting and competition is manifested. Is it constructive? Is it within the bounds? But I do think it's a little bit less about pro-Western versus pro-Russian, because I really don't see any real pro-Russian element of the party. Rather, it's more a conflict or confrontation or rivalry between the more idealistic elements and the more opportunistic elements. This is also why the personification of this party infighting involves the parliamentary speaker, Alan Simonyan, for example, who's both targeted and in many ways contributes to his own targeting. And I really think it's important that this is understood as normal and natural, but it must remain constructive and must graduate beyond the politics of personality, which the opposition is far too guilty of.
I want to touch on one thing that you mentioned, the new intelligence director, who was, it reminded me of this when you were talking about hazing. Recording this is now February 8th. We have 6 non-combat deaths in 2024. We have 6. It's a staggering number. 2 days ago, somebody died in a fire in one of the positions. For that, a vehicle rolled over. For that, there were a double murder. I mean, what the hell is going on?
Well, I would say that the heart of the problem is the absence of discipline. Perhaps this is what Andranik Kocharyan was talking about in terms of the need to shuffle the officer corps. There seems to be a breakdown in unit cohesion and discipline. My concern is the response. The response has been either ineffective or absent. Has anyone taken responsibility?
No.
Within the Ministry of Defense? Not really.
Even for the fire last year.
Exactly.
I've been told by somebody in the ministry, I wish I was making this up because it's heartbreaking, when I asked specifically about this, what's the deal with the non-combat deaths? The answer was, well, if you don't count the fire, the numbers are down. Fantastic. If you don't count the 2020 Karabakh War, it was a very peaceful year. I can skew the numbers too. But to issue this response with a straight face tells you just the level of self-preservation instinct and absolutely zero interest in taking responsibility. It's staggering.
Well, it's the lack of accountability.
Yeah.
And I also criticize the parliament. for doing far too little in their responsibility.
To protect citizens, yeah.
Also to investigate, to hold parliamentary hearings, for example. In other words, Parliament needs to do much more in terms of oversight.
They're busy with the 44-day war commission, which will have released any day now, right?
No comment.
Right. Sometimes this stuff is depressing. Well, Richard, I hate to end on this note, but thanks so much for coming. This has been enlightening as usual.
Thank you.
Thanks again for watching. It's been Patrick at ՍիվիլՆեթ. We'll speak with you all very soon.